I waited 3 years while my husband slowly poisoned me. Then I turned the tables. I met Austin when I was 26, and from the very beginning, everything about our relationship felt like a dream. He was 5 years older, confident without being arrogant, successful but not boastful, and most importantly, he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. We got married when I was 27, and for a while, it really did feel like a fairy tale. We lived in a cozy house on the outskirts of Raleigh, surrounded by trees and quiet roads. He worked in finance, something to do with asset management, and I taught art classes at a local community center. We had our routines: Sunday morning farmers markets, wine on the porch at night, spontaneous road trips when the mood struck. Everyone who knew us said we were the perfect couple, and I believed them. But around our third year of marriage, things started to change. At first, it was just little things. I was tired more often than usual, found myself forgetting where I put my keys or why I walked into a room. Then came the headaches. Not the kind you could shake off with a glass of water and some ibuprofen, but these deep, pulsing headaches that made it hard to focus on anything. I assumed it was stress, maybe even early burnout, so I cut back on my hours, tried yoga, drank more water. Nothing helped. Austin, to his credit, was wonderful through all of it. He held my hand in doctors' waiting rooms, brought me tea when I couldn't get out of bed, sat with me in emergency rooms during those especially bad nights. He told everyone that he had everything under control, that I just needed time and rest. And everyone believed him. Because why wouldn't they? He was the perfect husband, and I was too exhausted to argue otherwise. The thing is, when you're in the middle of something that doesn't make sense, you start doubting yourself before you doubt the people around you. When the memory lapses got worse, like forgetting conversations we'd had just hours before, I started to wonder if maybe I was the problem. I Googled everything from chronic fatigue syndrome to early onset Alzheimer's. But all my tests came back normal. No tumors, no infections, no real explanation. Just vague reassurances from doctors that I was probably just stressed. But something in me knew better. I wasn't just stressed. Something was wrong. Really wrong. And it didn't help that Austin had slowly started taking over every part of my life. At first, it felt like support. He'd handle the bills, run errands, make phone calls for appointments I kept forgetting. But then he started managing my schedule entirely. My art classes were quietly canceled. My friends stopped texting after too many unanswered messages. He even began speaking for me when we were with others, explaining my condition as if I wasn't right there in the room. By the time I realized how isolated I'd become, it was too late to pull myself out. I didn't trust my memory. I didn't trust my instincts. And worst of all, I didn't trust my own mind. Every time I questioned something, he'd gently correct me, tell me I must have forgotten or misunderstood. And after enough of those corrections, I started to believe him. It was easier than constantly fighting to remember what felt like half dreams. Then came the pills. Supplements, he said, prescribed by a new specialist he'd found. He'd crush them into my smoothies or hand them to me with breakfast. I never saw a label. He said it was easier that way. I wouldn't have to keep track of dosages or prescriptions. Just trust him. And I did. Because who else was there? It wasn't until I found an old journal tucked in a drawer, something I hadn't written in for months, that I finally saw the full picture. My handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the entries were clear. I had written down moments when I felt lucid, when I remembered something strange, when I suspected that Austin was doing more than just taking care of me. The entries didn't make sense at first, but as I read them one after another, the timeline became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't helping me. He was hurting me. Slowly, deliberately, and I had no idea why. The realization hit like a freight train. I sat on the floor, holding that journal, and for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt anger, and that anger is what saved me. But that's not the part I'm ready to tell yet. This part, the part where the fairy tale ends, that's the part one needed to get out first. Because not every monster hides in the dark. Some of them hold your hand in the hospital and smile while they poison you. It took me longer than I care to admit to see the pattern, and even when I did, I didn't want to believe it at first. There was this strange, almost imperceptible rhythm to the way my body responded to Austin's presence. A rhythm I didn't fully notice until he started traveling more for work. Those business trips were short, 3 or 4 days max, and he'd always leave with a drawn-out goodbye, kissing my forehead and reminding me to take it easy, that he'd miss me terribly. And at first, I did miss him, until I realized something strange. Every time he left, I started to feel better. Not miraculously healed or anything, but clearer, lighter. My headaches dulled to a faint throb. The fog in my brain lifted just enough for me to notice the contrast. I could sleep through the night without waking up drenched in sweat or confused about where I was. My appetite came back, and for once, food didn't sit like a rock in my stomach. I even felt well enough to call an old friend and chat for half an hour without struggling to follow the conversation. And every time he came back, the fog returned like clockwork. The first meal he cooked for me after each trip seemed to flip a switch in my body. Fatigue hit like a wall, the headaches returned with a vengeance, and the bone-deep ache in my muscles came crawling back, dragging my clarity down with it. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I was just overly sensitive to stress, and his absence gave me a chance to relax. That's what I told myself, clinging to any explanation that didn't make me sound insane. Because the alternative, the one that was growing louder in the back of my mind, was too awful to entertain. Not yet, but the cycle kept repeating. He'd leave. I'd improve. He'd come back. I'd fall apart again. The pattern became impossible to ignore. I started paying closer attention to the little things, like how I only ever felt nauseous after meals he cooked, and how the smoothies he insisted on making every morning, for your strength, babe, always tasted just a little off, too bitter or metallic. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe my taste buds were just being weird, maybe it was a vitamin or something I didn't recognize. But deep down, the pit in my stomach was growing heavier. Then came the day everything shifted. He was home for the weekend, and I was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with one of those headaches that made even the sound of the television unbearable. He brought me a cup of tea, chamomile, with honey and a slice of lemon, just like I liked it, and set it down gently on the coffee table beside me. He smiled like he always did when he was playing the role of doting husband, brushing my hair back from my forehead and whispering that I should try to sleep. But I didn't close my eyes. Not this time. I watched him walk into the kitchen, thinking I had dozed off, and that's when I saw it. I was half sitting, half lying on the couch, partially obscured by the armrest, and from that angle, I could see just enough through the open doorway. He stood at the counter, back turned, holding the mug I thought he had just given me. My mug. And then he did something that made my entire body go cold. He opened the top drawer beside the sink, not the one with the silverware, but the shallow one he always kept locked until recently, and pulled out a small plastic container. It wasn't labeled. He dipped a spoon into it, tapped something into the mug, stirred it twice, and returned with a soft smile like nothing had happened. My fingers were trembling as I took the cup from him, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. I didn't drink it. I said my stomach hurt too much, that I'd save it for later. He didn't push me, just kissed my temple and told me to rest, then sat beside me with his laptop like it was any other night. But I knew then, this wasn't just in my head. It wasn't anxiety, or stress, or overwork. It was him. And suddenly, every vague moment, every dismissed suspicion, every, "Are you sure you're not just tired?" conversation we'd had over the past year snapped into a horrifying focus. I had been doubting my sanity while the man I trusted most in the world was slowly poisoning me. And now that I knew, truly knew, I had to figure out what the hell I was going to do about it. Because the fairy tale was over, and I was trapped in something much, much darker. I thought the worst part was the moment I saw him tampering with my tea, but I was wrong. The worst part came after, when I finally gathered the courage to confront him, trembling hands, dry throat, heart pounding like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest, and realized I was already too far down the rabbit hole to be believed. It wasn't even a dramatic confrontation. I didn't scream or throw things or come at him with accusations. I waited until the next morning when we were both in the kitchen, sunlight pouring in through the window like the world was still pretending everything was normal. He was making toast, humming something soft and tuneless, like he didn't have a single care in the world. I told him I needed to talk. He smiled and said, "Of course, babe, what's on your mind?" So I asked, calmly, almost too calmly. I said I'd noticed the timing of my symptoms, that I always felt worse after the food he made. I didn't accuse him, not outright. I said it felt strange. I asked if he had put anything in my tea the night before. I didn't even say poison. I just asked a question. The shift was immediate and terrifying. His entire posture changed, his voice dropped just a little, and he got this look in his eyes, not angry, not shocked, just cold, calculating, like he had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head. He didn't deny it. Not right away. He laughed, like I'd just made the most ridiculous joke in the world, and said, "What are you talking about, baby? You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." Then he reached across the table and tried to take my hand, and I felt my skin crawl at his touch. I pulled away and said I saw him, that I watched him from the living room, that I knew something was off, that I remembered more than he thought I would. And that's when the real show began. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He just started filming. I didn't even notice at first. He slipped his phone out, started recording from the countertop with the camera angled just right. Then he began asking me leading questions, twisting my words back on me, repeating things I hadn't said, pretending to soothe me while baiting me into reacting. And I did. Of course I did. My hands were shaking, my chest was tight, my voice started to crack. I couldn't believe what he was doing, how calmly he was staging my breakdown in real time like he was directing a scene. The panic hit fast, my thoughts spiraling, my breath shallow. And he kept the camera steady the whole time. He said things like, "I know you're not feeling well, Nancy," and "maybe you forgot to take your meds today," and the more he said them, the more unhinged I must have looked. I was trying to explain myself, trying to remind myself, of what I'd seen, but the words came out garbled, frantic, terrified. Because I was terrified, and that's what he wanted. Later, I found out he had edited the footage, clipped the lead up, cut out the context, removed his condescension and manipulation, and left only the part where I was pacing the kitchen in a panic, tears on my cheeks, voice rising as I tried to be heard over the noise in my own head. He sent it to his sister, his coworkers, even my mom. Said I was going through something, that he was worried about my mental health, that he loved me but didn't know how to help anymore. And every person who saw it believed him. Because why wouldn't they? He was calm, composed, caring. I looked like a woman coming apart at the seams. My phone started lighting up with concerned messages. "Are you okay, honey? Maybe take a break from the internet. Call me when you're feeling better." I tried to explain, but it didn't matter. The more I pushed back, the more they worried. Because that's how the trap was built. He had turned my fear into evidence, my voice into noise, my truth into delusion. The worst part was when my mom came over. She hugged me too tightly, too long, like I was a child again, and she kept smoothing my hair back from my forehead, whispering that everything would be okay, that no one was mad, they just wanted to help. I tried to tell her what was really happening, but the look in her eyes shattered something in me. It was pity. She thought I was sick, and for the first time in my life, I saw her doubt me. That same night, Austin brought up the idea of a clinic. Said it softly, like a suggestion, not a plan. "Somewhere peaceful," he said, "where I could get real rest, where they could monitor my symptoms more closely." I stared at him across the dinner table, unable to speak. He poured me another cup of tea, the same way he always did, and smiled like he was already packing my bags in his head. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about control. This was about erasure. He wasn't trying to hurt me anymore. He was trying to erase me, one sip at a time. The day I decided to stop eating his food was the same day I stopped being his victim and became someone living a double life. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't scream or cry or threaten him with what I knew. I just nodded along like I always did, took the plate he handed me with that soft, rehearsed smile, and waited until he left the room before sliding the contents into a sealed container I hid in the back of the closet behind a box of winter clothes. I told him I had no appetite, that my stomach felt worse lately. He said it was stress. He always said it was stress. At night, I flushed pills when he wasn't looking. I poured tea down the bathroom sink. I flushed smoothies in small increments, careful not to leave behind a scent or a color that would raise suspicion. I started to lose weight, not a lot, just enough to make the lie believable. I acted slower, more confused. I slurred my words just enough that he wouldn't notice the difference between real and performance. If he thought I was spiraling, he'd let his guard down. And he did. While he thought I was drifting further into delusion, I was documenting everything. I installed a camera inside the bedroom smoke detector and another one behind a hollowed-out book on the shelf across from my nightstand. I had them routed to a cloud storage account he didn't know existed. I tested every food item he brought me, logging the smell, the taste, the way it made me feel, pretending to consume it while saving samples in Ziploc bags labeled with the date and time. I hid them in a locked box inside the garage freezer, disguised as frozen craft supplies. I stopped keeping my journal in the nightstand drawer. Instead, I transferred everything, notes, observations, physical symptoms, into a new notebook and mailed it to an old friend from college who lived 3 states away. I told her I was doing a creative project and needed a safe place to store drafts. She didn't ask questions. She was one of the few people left who hadn't swallowed his performance. I went further than that. I cut strands of my hair every few weeks and sealed them in labeled envelopes. I ordered a hair toxicology kit online using a burner email and shipped it to a P.O. box I opened under a fake name. It came back with results I'd already suspected, trace levels of substances that didn't make sense for someone not on prescribed medications. I documented every bit of it. It wasn't just about proving I was right anymore. It was about survival. I knew I couldn't confront him again. Not now. Not when he had the entire world convinced I was unraveling. So I played the part. I wore oversized sweaters, shuffled through the house like my bones ached, stopped brushing my hair for days at a time. I let him think he was winning. But behind the curtain, I was building my case. I saved voicemails where he talked about my condition, I made copies of insurance claims he filed for medications I never asked for. I recorded every conversation we had about psychiatric treatment and clipped the parts where he made passive threats disguised as concern. I visited a lawyer once a month under the guise of going to therapy, and she helped me catalog everything legally: time-stamped videos, digital records, witness statements. We created a backup drive, then 2 more. One went in a safety deposit box. One I mailed to my friend. One stayed in my car's spare tire compartment. He never noticed. Or maybe he didn't want to believe I was capable of hiding anything from him. That was his mistake. He thought I was weak. He thought he had broken me. What he didn't know was that I had spent 2 years becoming someone else entirely. Someone quiet. Someone strategic. Someone who could wear a mask longer than he ever imagined. And while he polished his image and played the concerned husband, I was laying every brick of the truth in silence, one piece at a time. Because when the time came, I wouldn't just accuse him. I would expose him. I knew no one would believe me if I just walked into a police station with a stack of notes and a story that sounded like something out of a psychological thriller. I had tried that road before, in softer ways, and all it did was push people further into Austin's narrative. The good husband with a sick wife. The poor man just trying to hold it all together. So I waited. I watched. I planned. And when I had everything I needed, when the videos, the hair tests, the food samples, the witness statements, and the medical data were all locked into place, I set one final trap. One that would end the guessing. I invited my friend Vita over for dinner. She was one of the few people who hadn't fully bought into Austin's version of things. She'd been cautious, yes, but kind. She called to check in, sent messages when no one else did, and even though she didn't outright say it, I could tell she had doubts. I needed someone like that in the room. Someone neutral enough to witness what was about to happen, but close enough to care. Austin loved playing host, especially when it gave him a chance to show off his version of our life. He made roasted chicken with his usual flair: thyme, garlic, lemon wedges stuffed under the skin, that buttery glaze he always prided himself on. He served the plates like he always did, generous portions with practiced precision. I watched him closely, noting which plate was mine. He set it in front of me, without hesitation, and then turned to pour the wine. I swapped the plates the second his back was turned, quiet and fluid like I'd rehearsed it 100 times in my head. My heart was pounding so loud I thought Vita might hear it. I could barely swallow the sip of wine I took afterward. He came back, sat down, toasted to friends and healing, and began eating without the slightest clue. We made small talk for about 20 minutes, mostly about Vita's new job and some show she'd been binging. I forced laughter when appropriate, nodded along, tried not to choke on the tension building in my throat. I didn't touch my food. Neither did Vita. She'd eaten beforehand and was just picking at a salad. Austin, though, he cleared his plate like he always did, even dabbed the remaining sauce with a piece of bread. The change came quicker than I expected. At first, he rubbed his forehead like he had a sudden headache, blinked a few times too slowly. Then his fork slipped from his hand and clattered against the plate. He mumbled something. I think he was trying to ask for water, but the words didn't land. His mouth slackened, and his eyes went wide, then dull. It was like watching a puppet lose its strings in real time. Vita stood up fast, nearly knocking over her chair. "Austin," she said, her voice sharp and rising. He tried to respond, but it came out as a slurred jumble of vowels, barely audible. His hands twitched on the table. His body swayed forward like he was about to fall face-first into the dishes. I stood too, calmly, and placed my hand on Vita's shoulder. "Call an ambulance," I said, and she didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911 while I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a binder I had prepared months in advance. I set it on the table and opened it in front of her, clear sleeves filled with printed emails, screenshots, test results, timestamps, clipped transcripts, and annotated videos. "This is what he's been doing to me," I said quietly as she spoke to the dispatcher, her eyes scanning the pages with disbelief. "This is how I've been living." By the time the paramedics arrived, Austin couldn't speak at all. He was conscious but incoherent, slumped in the kitchen chair with drool gathering at the corner of his mouth. They checked his vitals, asked questions he couldn't answer, loaded him onto the stretcher while Vita stood frozen in the doorway. I handed one of the EMTs a sealed bag with what remained of the food from his plate and said, "Tell the ER to test it. Tell them I swapped it with mine." The woman gave me a strange look, but nodded and took the bag. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when they wheeled him out. Not when Vita finally whispered, "Oh my God," as she pieced together the timeline, and not when the house went quiet again. I just stood there, shaking slightly, staring at the 2 identical plates still on the table, one untouched, one licked clean. Because that was the moment the pretending ended. And I knew, no matter what came next, he wouldn't be able to twist this into a lie. Not anymore. The hospital kept him for 48 hours under observation. His vitals were stable, but the toxicology report confirmed the presence of the exact compounds I'd been tracking for almost 2 years, the same ones that showed up in my hair, in the food samples, in the pills he insisted were supplements. The report didn't lie. He had ingested what he had been feeding me, and it hit his system like a confession. The police didn't hesitate. They interviewed me at the hospital, then again at home. I gave them everything: the binder, the backups, the footage, the time-stamped recordings. I handed over the keys to his safe, knowing exactly what they'd find inside. I had watched him open it a dozen times with the same absent-minded flourish, like he didn't think the contents inside would ever betray him. But they did. Inside the safe, they found the journals. Neat, clinical handwriting. Dosages. Timelines. Adjustments. My name in the margins next to dosage increases. Phrases like dependency window, mild disorientation ideal, and if baseline holds, introduce second compound, written like he was mapping out an experiment. Which, I guess he was. I wasn't a wife. I was a project. A hypothesis. A controlled environment. And he was meticulous about it. Next to the journals were vials, some half full, others labeled in shorthand I couldn't decipher, and a black prescription pad bearing the name of a small pharmacy downtown. That's when Otto's name surfaced. Otto was the friend I had barely noticed, the one who always showed up at game nights with beer and jokes, who stayed late to help clean up, who worked behind a pharmacy counter and smiled like someone with nothing to hide. But he was in it. Deep. The investigators traced the compounds to his inventory, cross-referenced prescriptions, found surveillance footage of him passing off unmarked containers to Austin in parking lots and behind the store after hours. But by the time they pieced it together, Otto was gone. He'd packed up and disappeared overnight, vanishing before a warrant could be served. His apartment was empty, his car abandoned near the state line. No phone activity, no credit card trail, just gone, like smoke. Austin was arrested 2 days later at the hospital as he signed discharge papers. They didn't even let him put his shoes on before cuffing him. He looked stunned, hollow, like he didn't understand how things had turned, like he still thought he could talk his way out of it. And honestly, I think he did try. From the moment they read him his rights, he was already planting seeds, insisting I had a history of mental illness, that I'd fabricated the evidence, that I was obsessed with being sick, that he'd been documenting my decline to protect himself. He played the victim with such ease it was like breathing. And the worst part? People believed him. Not the detectives, not the judge, not the doctors who reviewed the toxicology, but the people closest to me, my neighbors, my coworkers, and my mother, who once held me through flu seasons and scraped knees, who used to rub my back when I couldn't sleep, sat across from me with her lips pursed, and said, "Nancy, maybe you imagined some of this. Maybe you were confused." Even after I showed her the journals, even after the arrest, even after the safe, she still looked at me like I was a story she didn't understand. "He loved you," she whispered, like that somehow canceled everything. He wouldn't do this. Maybe Otto, maybe he manipulated him. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just nodded, because I was done trying to convince people who had already decided who I was. Let them believe what they needed to sleep at night. I knew the truth. I had lived it. I had bled for it. And now it was out in the open where it could finally breathe. No more lies. No more poison. No more pretending. Just silence. And in that silence, something that finally felt like peace. The trial was every bit as brutal as I had feared, not because the truth wasn't on my side, but because Austin was so damn good at pretending. He walked into that courtroom in a tailored suit with that same calm expression he used to wear when he told friends I was just having a rough patch. He nodded solemnly. He made eye contact with the jury. He even smiled at me once, like this was just another misunderstanding we'd work through, like he still believed he could flip the script. His lawyer leaned hard into the narrative we both knew he'd been setting up for years. That I was unstable, that I'd suffered a mental break, that Austin had tried to help me, to care for me, to protect me from myself, that everything I claimed, the poisoning, the manipulation, the surveillance, was evidence of delusion, not abuse. They painted me as obsessed with illness, unwell, dangerous even. They implied I had poisoned him that night, that I had turned his love into a weapon. They called it Munchausen by proxy in reverse. Whatever the hell that means. But then came the video. The footage I had spent months compiling. The hidden cameras. The timestamps. The slow, silent proof of what I'd endured. I watched the jury lean forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to unease to horror. They saw him stir something into my tea. They saw him take pills out of unmarked bottles and crush them into smoothies. They saw me flush food, hide capsules, stagger through the house with fog in my eyes. And then came the toxicology reports. The journals. The prescription records tied directly to Otto's inventory. The financial transactions. The secret emails between them discussing calibration and tolerance. The expert testimony confirming the substances matched the levels in my system over time. And then, finally, Vida. She sat on that witness stand, steady and clear, recounting the night Austin lost control of his own body. She described the dinner, the plate swap, the way he slurred his words and collapsed onto the table. She told them I had been calm, that I hadn't eaten, that I had warned her to expect something she couldn't yet understand. And by the time she finished, I knew the performance was over. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When the verdict came in, Austin didn't move. 15 years without the possibility of parole. Otto got 8 after a separate plea. He tried to cut a deal, but the evidence was too strong, too detailed, too deliberate. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no dramatic gasp, just the quiet rustle of paperwork and the sound of a gavel coming down like an exhale. I didn't cry. I thought I might. I wanted to. But the relief didn't feel like joy. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the fall was over. I had survived, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied, like the fight had been everything, and now there was nothing left to push against. After the sentencing, people came up to me. Strangers, officers, even one of the jurors. They said I was brave, that I was strong, that they didn't know how I had held it together. And I smiled and said thank you, even though I didn't feel strong. I felt wrecked. And still, my mother didn't believe me. She sat in the back during sentencing, clutching her purse like it held the version of reality she needed to survive. She didn't look at me. When I approached her afterward, she stood up and said, "You've always had a vivid imagination." Then she walked out. No hug, no question, no room for the evidence. Just the myth of a perfect son-in-law she refused to let go of. There's no rehabilitation plan for that kind of betrayal. No program, no therapy session, no timeline. You just learn to carry it. Like scar tissue under the skin, healed, but never quite the same. I started physical rehab 6 months ago to rebuild what I'd lost in my body. But the rest, the trust, the voice, the sense of safety, that's going to take longer. Maybe a lifetime. And even now, when people say I must feel vindicated, I just nod. Because what they don't understand is that the victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in every day I stayed alive long enough to make it there. We left on a Wednesday. No dramatic goodbye, no packed audience waving from a driveway. Just me, Vida, and the road stretching ahead of us, sun filtering through the windshield, quiet music playing low enough that neither of us had to talk unless we wanted to. She had offered the spare room months ago, told me I didn't owe her anything, that I didn't have to explain or justify or act grateful. Just come. Just start over. So I did. The new city is smaller, slower. We're renting a place near a park, and every morning I sit on the porch with my tea, one I made myself, and I watch people walk their dogs or ride their bikes, or just move through the world like it's not a terrifying place. Some days I feel jealous of them. Other days, I feel proud that I'm still here to see it. The doctors say my liver is permanently compromised. My kidneys are functioning, but not fully. My nervous system, especially my memory and sensory balance, may never be what it was. They explain things in calm, detached voices, like this is just a consequence of biology. And maybe it is. But I know what did this. I know who did this. And I know I'm still standing in spite of it. Because I waited. I endured. I suffered in silence while pretending I was slipping. I let him think he was winning while I took note of every bruise, every foggy day, every tremor. I stayed long enough to build the kind of evidence they couldn't dismiss. And even then, I almost broke. 3 years. 3 years of pretending not to see what he was doing. Of hiding the proof. Of stitching myself back together in secret. 3 years of living like a ghost in my own home. But I made it. I don't trust easily now. I don't eat anything I haven't cooked. I still flinch when someone stands too close behind me. I check the locks twice before bed. But I wake up in a room that feels safe. I fall asleep without fear. I open my windows when it rains, and I breathe without tasting poison in the air. This wasn't the life I imagined for myself. I didn't picture scars on my body or flashbacks triggered by kitchen smells or the way I instinctively scan a room for exits. But it's mine. I earned it. And if you've read this far, I hope you take something from it. Maybe it's the strength to trust your instincts. Maybe it's the reminder that no one else gets to define your reality. Or maybe it's just the quiet understanding that survival doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes, it looks like waiting, documenting, enduring, and finally, walking away when the time is right.